Good evening. We turn our attention to the 12th and 13th chapter of the book of Exodus. Tonight I want to get us out of Egypt. And we find in chapter 12, verse 33, that the Egyptians say and beg for the Israelites to leave. Verse 33, the Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We will all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls, bound up the clothes on their shoulders. And the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing. And the Lord God had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Now the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. They baked the dough which they had brought out of Egypt into cakes of unleavened bread, for it had not become leavened, since they were driven out of Egypt, and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. Verse 33, the Egyptians have come to a place where they are ready to get rid of the Israelites. And they says, let them go, or we're all going to be dead. So God's people are leaving. They take their items that God had said to prepare so they could leave quickly, in verse 34. And we are told that they ask the Egyptians for gold and clothing. And these items would later be used for the components of the tabernacle. They will also be used in an unholy way with the building of the golden calf by none other than Aaron. So this is not only the favor and the bounty of God, but we also see that it's possible to use God's giftings for non-holy and non-godly things. So God will bless them. Interestingly, there's this, excuse me, it says plundering. This is called Egyptian gold. And it is this text that oftentimes is used to say, to defend the use of worldly items or worldly goods for the sake of the kingdom. How is God going to build the tabernacle? He's going to build it with the goods of Egypt. So they're bringing with them these items that once had an ungodly use or an unholy use, and now it is given a good and godly use. It is a passage like this that also affirms that all truth is God's truth, and it is how the item is used that determines whether it is good or bad. For example, a knife is excuse me, amoral. On its own can do nothing, but that same knife can be used to cut meat or prepare food, and it can also be used in sin to murder someone. And God would say that all truth is His truth, and He is equipping His people with Egyptian gold. Some unique and interesting, fruitful for the mind articles about Egyptian gold and the implications thereof, about how believers can use things from non-believers and repurpose it, if you will, for a greater good. So they leave, and they leave pretty wealthy, but they're not going to be spending it in the wilderness. He has given that to them so that they would be able to worship him later. Verse 36, they receive this because God has given favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and so they leave. Verse 37, we are given some geography of how from where they travel to where they to travel. 600,000 people on foot, men. This is roughly the size of their army. A little over 500,000 people, and that's just men. And so some conservative estimates of how many people leave, you're looking at potentially 1.5 million to 2.5 million people, very feasibly. Moses doesn't have cell phone. He doesn't have Google Maps. He doesn't have any of these things, and he's going to be leading the people. So we'll see some real clear organizational patterns. We're entering into some chapters that are used in leadership development classes because Moses is going to have to use good, sound principles to lead this many people, because he's not going to be able to do it by himself. He's going to try, but he's going to fail miserably. So lots of folks that are leaving. Okay. Verse 38, he says, a mixed multitude comes with them, along with flocks, herds, and a large number of livestock. Who's this mixed multitude? I like how the King James uses this phrase a little bit later on in, especially the book of Numbers. It calls it the rabble. The rabble. And so these will be Egyptians who come with them. So not only do the Egyptians give them gold and give them garments, but the Egyptians, some of them also believe. We saw when Pharaoh, during the 9th and 10th plague, that Pharaoh was losing even support of his own people. And they were beginning to believe and fear the God of the Israelites. And so this mixed multitude is going to come with them, and they're partial Egyptians, non-Israelites, I guess would be a better way to put it, who believe. And this is going to be, it's kind of a mixed bag, pun intended. They are going to be assets, but they're also going to be liabilities, because they're going to they're going to be one of the first ones to get homesick and are going to lure the people of God to kind of wish that they had Egypt and not just simply this vacant land in the wilderness. Verse 39, we're told of they're obeying God and what God had asked them to do in regard of their supplies and how they should travel promptly. Verse 40, we're given a time stamp, and this goes back to Genesis. This is God's promise to Abraham, his covenant, that he says that I'm going to, in Genesis 15, he says, I'm going to make you a people. He says, but the time is not yet. And he says there's still Amalekites in the land, there's still Canaanites in the land, and their time of judgment is not yet. And so we got 4 centuries that need to pass until the time of their judgment. And this is the time stamp that says, okay, 4 centuries and 30 years, it's now time for the Canaanites, for the people in the promised land to be judged, and they're going to be judged by God's people. It's so interesting in God's economy how he judges nations, and oftentimes he judges nations externally with other nations, whether those be godly, holy nations, such as his own people, or whether it be complete pagans, like Belshazzar, and the king of the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, how God uses even pagans to accomplish his will. But even they are going to be punished because of their evil atrocities against whomever they are exercising judgment against. Verse 41, at the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. So they all go. So when you look at this chapter, excuse me, and the first chapter, 70 Israelites went up. Jacob's family comprised of about 70 people. 70 came up, and nearly 2.5 million people leave. So a lot has happened. Verses 42 and through 49, we have already discussed. This is the ordinance of the Passover. When they get over into the Promised Land, this is what they're going to be observing. Verse 50 and 51, we are just kind of giving some closure that everything that God had said, they did. And they, 50 is just one of those verses that's stating what God had asked they had done. It says, then all the sons of Israel did so. They did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. They're not always going to be this compliant, but it is worth noting, and it is a noble enterprise to do all that he has said. And they will say on multiple occasions, whatever he tells us, we will do. And for the most part, they did. However, their obedience was short-lived. It wasn't long-term through the more difficult seasons. When it's obvious that mountain is shaking and there's a voice coming from it, and when it's obvious that that lightning on that mountain is very choreographed in an unusual way, that this is not a typical storm and this is not a typical a lightning show, that this is indeed from God. It's easy to say, hey, whatever he says we will do. But whenever you're away from that mountain and you are in the wilderness and you're hungry, or you're coming upon an enemy that looks pretty ferocious, it's at those points that faith is really put to a place where I will either demonstrate it or I will rebel. And so I find it encouraging that they say all that he has said we will do, but I also realize that it's in the context of him doing good things to them already. It's in the context of victory that they say that. Because in the context of suffering, is it always, do we do it that well? So that wraps up chapter 12. Now I want to highlight chapter 13. Just a couple of things, because at the time of this recording, we're entering Thanksgiving week, and there's and then following that, Christmas. But in this text, there is a verse that is, especially being the father of three, and one of those three is 5. There's a lot of these questions being asked. So the first several verses, first dozen or so verses in chapter 13, is Moses is calling his people to when they begin this journey, to consecrate, to set apart for the Lord's use the firstborn, not only human but in animal as well. Now the contrast is, okay, chapter 13, you are consecrating the firstborn. In chapter 12, you are burying the firstborn. They are dying if the blood was not applied. So there is a contrast there. There's this designated, almost as though there's an offering, a wrath offering. But here they are to consecrate their children. Verse 10, let me jump in. Well, look at verse 1 and 2. It says, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, sanctify to me every firstborn, the first offspring of every womb among the sons of Israel, both man and beast, it belongs to me. And he's going to explain why. Remember this day in which you went out from Egypt, from the house of slavery, for by a powerful hand the Lord brought you out of this place, and nothing leavened shall be eaten. So Just like the death of the firstborn signaled when they could leave, when they do leave, the consecration of the firstborn is going to be a testimony of worship that they are rejoicing in what God has accomplished through the death of the firstborn. Death is going to occur in the Exodus. It will either be a voluntary death of the substitute offering, or it will be an involuntary death of those in rebellion. So they're to perform this consecration. Well, verse 11. Now when the Lord brings you to the land of the Canaanite, as he swore to you and to your fathers, that's Genesis, and gives it to you, you shall devote to the Lord the first offspring of every womb and the first offspring of every beast that you own. The males belong to the Lord. So there's just a recap of what we've just said. Look at verse 14. And it shall be, when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is this? Then you shall say to him, with a powerful hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. It came about when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed every firstborn in the land of Egypt. And he's going to go on to continue to explain the significance here. So, verse 14, when your son asks, Dad, what does this mean? Then here's what you are to say, with a powerful hand. Now, verse 14, that statement with a powerful hand goes all the way back to verse 3. And so essentially the father is to tell the son through oral tradition what the scriptures say. This was an oral tradition. It was more auditory than it was written. And so there is the telling and the retelling. That's why the whole Passover meal was not only about eating, but you were telling at different phases of the meal with each cup. And there were 4. With each cup, you would tell a segment of the story. This oral tradition was passed along, preserving the testimony of God. So when your son asks, you tell him. And so when our children ask us, what does Thanksgiving mean? What does Christmas mean? Why is there a baby? Why is there a star? Why is there the killing of other babies? Then we are able to proclaim the message of God, and we can give some interpretation and explanation that would then lead to application. Why is it that he had to come? As we come together next time looking at the Word, we will begin looking at God leading his people out, and we will see just a beautiful orchestration and use of nature that God will use to get his people to where he wants them. God can move heaven and earth for his children. He not only can, but he does. And so it'll be exciting to take a look at God leading his people through here. But before he leads them out, he prepares them. And he prepares them with gold and fabric. And that'll be for the temple or the tabernacle. And he prepares them for worship. He tells them how to worship. I think it's just very interesting that the final instructions before they leave is not about, okay, here's how we're going to travel. Here's how we're going to sleep. And this is how far we're going to try to go to. There's no travel plans. Everything is spiritual. Everything is God-centered. And so even in the midst of a very stressful situation, these people are getting ready to leave the home, even though they were slaves. They're getting ready to leave all that was familiar to them. And they're leaving in a moment's notice. They're not leaving Egypt and then they've got a spot to go to. They don't have that. And so when they're walking out of Egypt, they're walking with all that they have, all that belongs to them. And And so this is a time filled with much emotion, much faith, much perseverance, and God is he's going to lead his people out. But before he does, he prepares them spiritually. I knew of a family that were getting ready to move from where they were to another state, and the husband would drove ahead a month or several months before they were to move, and not just simply looking for a home, but looking for a church home. So that by the time they got here, there were at least either some options, or he was pretty settled on a place and wanted to bring the family to be part of that. So, point being, God was preparing his people to leave, and he prepared them to have good, strong, solid spiritual practices at play. What a passage that reminds us of the preparation of our Lord, getting us ready for the salvation that we can enjoy. I pray that the word of our Lord will serve to be an easy platform by which to build your life upon, and that the Bible is not just simply a book to learn and to study, but a book to live out. And I hope and pray that we are living it out. I love you guys, and I look forward to seeing you soon. God bless. You have a wonderful night.